Good afternoon. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Evans for organizing this wonderful panel and for extending the invitation to me so I could come here and share my thoughts on Du Bois. All right. As I was reading Du Bois's work and contemplating what I would say today, I began to think about the creation of knowledge. As I was reading through Du Bois's work, I began to ask questions about how knowledge is constructed, about how information is constructed and distributed. And also, I started thinking about facts. Who create facts? For every fact, there's a fact maker, someone who's creating that information. And I will start today by saying that Du Bois was clearly a pioneer in developing, in helping to develop an African-centered approach to the study of Black history. Again, I will say that Du Bois was a pioneer in developing an African-centered approach to this study of Black history. What I will be doing today is talk about the historiography, talk about the contributions that Du Bois has made to our understanding of Africa and people of African descent. Du Bois used social sciences as a tool to fight racial and social injustice. He believed that knowledge was power, that one could use social sciences, could use academia, knowledge to challenge racist views as well as to empower African people and people of African descent. To this end, Du Bois has made significant contributions to our understanding of African history, culture, and really the place that Africa has in world history. As early as 1901, Du Bois was thinking about putting together an encyclopedia. As early as 1901, Du Bois was beginning to think about putting together Encyclopedia Africana. He saw this book, this work that he envisioned, as a challenge to the prevailing views of Black people, of Africans, of people of African descent. We are talking about the early 1900s. This is around the time when pseudoscientists are coming up with all these so-called scientific studies, studies that sought to show that Black people were inferior, studies that claimed that Africa had no history, at least history that is worthy of respect. In the 1930s, when Du Bois wrote some of the works that we're discussing today, we see in Africa the development of colonial historiography, colonial officers who were given the task of writing the histories of people under their rule. and the stories, the histories that come out of that era tended to focus on claims that Africans were backwards, Africans had no history worth of respect, that Africa made no contribution whatsoever to world civilization. So it's under that context that Du Bois is putting out this research, this body of knowledge that begins to challenge a lot of these assumptions about Black people and Black history. Du Bois was concerned with educating Black people. In his own words, and I quote, he was concerned about the part which Africa has played in world history. Concerned about the part which Africa has played in world history. Now, in working to create this body of knowledge, Du Bois is very aware of some of the limitations. He talks about the fact that there are limitations in some of the languages. He's talking about sources that were available to him in writing the histories that he wanted to write. So he points out, for example, that there are all these primary sources that are written in some ancient languages. He argues that there are sources in Portuguese, sources in Arabic, sources that could help inform scholars and transform the way we study and understand African history. Now, as Du Bois accumulates books after books that deal with African history, you can see how he is changing, how sources that are available to him allow him to change what he writes about Africa. For example, in some of his early works, he argued that first human beings came out of Asia and then went to Africa. But later, as archaeologists produced more studies that showed that Africa was really the cradle of humankind, civilization, Du Bois changes that perspective. Most of his early writings tended to focus on correcting myths about Africa, myths about African history. We begin to see a shift after the 1930s, where even his idea of Pan-Africanism also begins to change, and he begins to focus on imperialism and the fight against colonialism. And we begin to see in a lot of his writings what some of the things that he observed and read were happening in Africa in the 1930s and 40s. He talks about colonialism and its impact on Africans. He talks about colonialism and its impact on Africans. How colonial education impacted the way in which Africans identified themselves. He talks and writes about the exploitation of Africa. And so, by the 1940s, Du Bois had accumulated a body of work that had really begun to change the way we study Africa, the way we understand Africa in world history. He helped place Africa at the center at the time when most studies, most European-centered studies, were emphasizing Europeans, European involvement in Africa, European contribution to civilization. I will close my remarks by saying that Du Bois, again, played an important role in shaping an African-centered approach to our understanding of African history, how we study African history. And I will stop there.